But je was pas masin. She was 7 years old, wearing long sleeves in 104-degree heat, and she didn't make a sound when the bottle slipped from her fingers and hit the gas station floor. That was the part that stopped Hank Mercer cold, not the sleeves, not the way she flinched when the man behind the counter said, "Hey, you need help?" Not even the bruise climbing up the side of her neck like a shadow somebody forgot to erase. It was the silence. The absolute, practiced, deliberate silence of a child who had learned, been taught, that making noise only made things worse. Hank had heard that silence before. In Fallujah, in the VIA waiting room, in the bathroom mirror at 3 in the morning when the nightmares wouldn't stop, and his daughter was sleeping down the hall, and he couldn't figure out how to be a father to someone when he barely remembered how to be a human being. He picked up the bottle. He held it out. She looked at his hand like it might be a trap. If you think you know where this story goes, you don't. Because what happened next in that gas station in Prescott, Arizona, on the worst Thursday in August, was not a rescue. It was a recognition. And recognition, in the world Hank Mercer had lived in for 47 years, was always the most dangerous thing. Ponson. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and stay until the very end. These stories go places most people don't dare follow. Drop a like and leave a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. We want to know how far this road reaches. Now, let's ride. The gas station sat at the edge of Prescott on Route 89, the kind of place that existed between things. Between the city and the desert, between people who had somewhere to go and people who had nowhere left. 2 pumps, a cracked awning the color of old bone, a refrigerator unit inside that hummed like it was in pain. Hank had pulled in on his 2009 Road King because the heat gauge was climbing and he was 3 hours into a ride he hadn't planned, which was the only kind of riding he did anymore. Since the club voted him in as president 8 months ago, the road had become the only place he could think without somebody needing something from him. He wasn't running from anything. He'd told himself that every mile since Tucson. He didn't believe it anymore. The girl was standing in front of the refrigerator case when he walked in. Small, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that someone had attempted and given up on. The long-sleeved shirt was faded pink, the kind of pink that had been washed too many times, and it hung off her shoulders wrong, like it had belonged to someone else first. She was reaching for a bottle of water on the second shelf, the kind of reaching that takes your whole body, and her arms weren't going all the way up. He noticed that. He filed it away the way he used to file things in the field, not consciously, just into the part of his brain that tracked what didn't fit. She got the bottle, held it with both hands. Then her fingers slipped on the condensation and it hit the tile floor and rolled under the case, and she just stopped. Stood there. Didn't cry, didn't curse, didn't look around for help, just went still with her eyes down like she was calculating the cost of whatever came next. The man behind the counter, 50, gut, Diamondback's cap, the unmistakable energy of someone who'd been on his feet since 6 a.m., said, "Hey, sweetheart, you need help?" She didn't look up. She took one step back. The counterman looked at Hank. Hank looked at the girl. He crouched down, 6'2" of leather and road grime folding itself to the floor, which was not a graceful thing, and reached under the refrigerator case and pulled out the bottle. He stood. He held it out. The girl looked at his hand, then she looked at his face. She had gray eyes, which surprised him, and they were doing the thing he recognized, the rapid, unconscious threat assessment that people learned when they needed to learn it, when the environment made it a survival skill instead of paranoia. She was reading him, figuring out what he wanted, calculating the exit. "It's just water," he said. She took it, fast, then took 2 steps back. He went to the cooler and grabbed a coffee. The gas station kind, burnt and terrible, which was the only kind he drank anymore, and went to the counter. He didn't look at her again directly, but he was aware of her the way you're aware of a fire in the room. "She come in alone?" he asked the counterman. Low, casual. The man shrugged. "Lady dropped her off, said she'd be back in 10 minutes. He checked the clock above the cigarette display. That was 40 minutes ago. Hank paid for the coffee and the water. He paid for the girl's water without thinking about it, just added it, and the counterman didn't say anything about it. and walked outside. He stood by the pumps in the burning August air and drank the coffee and watched Route 89 in both directions. No car came. 20 minutes later, a white sedan pulled in hard enough to kick gravel, and a woman got out moving fast, the energy of someone who was late and blamed everyone else for it. 30s, highlights that needed a touch-up, flip-flops, a phone in one hand, and the agitation of 3 different problems happening at once visible in the set of her shoulders. She came into the station. Hank heard her through the open door. Lily, come on, we're late. I told you to stay by the door." And then quieter, low enough that probably she thought it didn't carry. "I swear to God, you are more trouble than you are worth." Hank stood with his coffee and his back to the window and the desert in front of him, flat and burning and indifferent, and felt something move in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not pity. Pity was useless. He'd learned that at the VA when the counselors looked at the veterans with soft eyes and said, "We understand what you've been through," and none of them had been through anything close. Not rage either, though the rage was there, underneath, coiled and familiar. What he felt was recognition, pure and cold and exact. He knew what that sentence did to a child, not from textbooks, from 30 years of watching what happened to people who grew up inside it, the way it calcified, the way it became the voice in the back of your head that never really left, no matter how many miles you put between yourself and the person who said it. You are more trouble than you are worth. 7 words. A sentence that took 3 seconds to say and a lifetime to stop hearing. He turned around. The woman, he'd learn her name later, Sandra Voss, though it wouldn't mean much to him because names were just containers, and this container was rotten, was pulling the girl by the wrist toward the door. Not violently. Not the kind of thing a bystander would step in for. Just the casual physical dominance of someone who had never been taught that a child's body belonged to the child. The girl, Lily, walked with her head down. She didn't look at Hank as they passed, but right before the door closed, she turned her head just slightly, just enough, and she glanced back at the water bottle in her hand. Then she was gone. Hank finished his coffee. He crushed the cup and dropped it in the trash by the pump. He stood in the August heat with the engine of his Road King ticking as it cooled and thought about the direction the white sedan had gone. He had a club to get back to. He had a vice president who was handling 3 problems that required his attention. He had a phone with 11 unread messages and a daughter in Flagstaff who hadn't returned his last call. He stood there anyway. Then he got on his bike and followed the sedan. That's it. He wasn't following it, exactly. He told himself that. He was going the same direction because there was only one road out of that part of Route 89 that went into the residential grid, and he needed the highway junction anyway, and it was just coincidence that the white sedan was 200 yards ahead of him, and he was keeping exactly that distance. 14 years in the Marines had made him very good at lying to himself about what he was doing and why. The sedan turned into a neighborhood off Copper Basin Road. Not the worst neighborhood in Prescott. The worst neighborhoods in Prescott were further east, where the houses were smaller and the yards had given up. This was the kind of neighborhood that used to be decent and had simply stopped trying. Chain-link fences, sprinkler systems that hadn't worked in years, a basketball hoop with no net, rusting at the end of a driveway. The sedan pulled into the 3rd driveway on the left. Hank drove past without slowing, which was the right call, which was what you did when you were being careful and not making decisions yet. He got to the junction. He pulled over on the shoulder. He sat for 6 minutes, engine idling, watching the heat bend the air above the asphalt. Then he turned around. He didn't stop at the house. He didn't have a reason to stop at the house, not one that would hold up to anyone asking. He just rode back through the neighborhood slowly, the Road King at walking pace, taking in the landscape with the same practiced quiet he'd used in 2 combat deployments and 8 years of running his club through situations that required observation before action. The house was a 1-story, beige stucco, brown trim, the universal color scheme of resignation, the sedan in the driveway, a truck parked on the street, dark green, Ram 1500, the kind of truck that was older than its stickers admitted, with a back windshield decal of a skull and a cowboy hat that was supposed to communicate something about the driver. There was a man in the front yard, late 30s, built the way men got built when they worked with their hands and didn't think about it, shirtless in the heat, doing something with a garden hose that didn't require the level of anger he was directing at it. He glanced up when Hank rode past. The glance lasted too long, the kind of look that was itself a message. Hank clocked it, clocked the body language, clocked the way the man's jaw was set. He rode back to the highway. He sat in a diner on Gurley Street for 2 hours and ate a breakfast he didn't taste and thought about things that were none of his business. The waitress refilled his coffee 3 times without him asking, which meant she was either very good at her job or she understood something about men who sat at corner booths with their backs to the wall and their eyes on the door. Probably both. His phone buzzed. Rudy, his VP, Raymond Rudy Castillo, 39 years old, Desert Iron's vice president for 6 years, the man who actually kept the club functional, while Hank was its symbolic and operational center. The text said, "Council wants to know if you're coming back today." Hank typed, "Tomorrow." Then he put the phone face down. He thought about Lily's hands on the water bottle, the way she'd done the threat assessment on him, the bruise on her neck, the long sleeves in August. He thought about the man in the yard and the look that was a message. He thought about the VA social worker he'd spoken to 4 years ago when he was trying to help a Desert Iron brother get his kids out of a bad custody situation. And the social worker had said, "I understand your concern, but we need documented evidence and a formal complaint before we can initiate an investigation." Bureaucratic language for, "not my problem yet." He thought about his daughter, Maya, 19 years old, living with her mother in Flagstaff, studying environmental science, smart as hell and deeply, specifically angry at him for reasons he understood entirely and couldn't fix with an apology. Their last conversation had been 63 days ago. He knew the number because he had it written on a gas station receipt in his wallet, like some kind of penance. He pulled a 20 out of his wallet, weighted it under the coffee cup, and left. He went back to the neighborhood at dusk. Not to the house. He parked on the street 2 blocks away, where the sightlines were clear, and the reason for being there was ambiguous enough that nobody would bother him, and sat on his bike and watched. The lights came on in the house at 7:40. The truck was still there. At 8:15, a window in the back of the house went dark. A bedroom probably, which meant someone was going to sleep. The man came out onto the front step once, around 9, lit a cigarette, looked at his phone, went back inside. Hank noted all of it, not because he had a plan. Because planning required deciding that this was his business, and he hadn't decided that yet. At 9:47, the light in what he was now fairly certain was the girl's room clicked on. He couldn't see the window clearly from his position, just the square of yellow light against the stucco. It stayed on for 18 minutes. Then it went out. He rode back to the motel he'd booked on his phone. He lay on top of the covers in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the AC unit rattle and thought about what he was doing. He was a 47-year-old man with a past that looked exactly the way it looked. 2 combat deployments, a marriage that hadn't survived him coming home, a daughter who'd stopped calling back, and 15 years with the Desert Iron Motorcycle Club, the last 8 as an officer and the last 8 months as president. He had a record that was old enough to be irrelevant in most conversations, but present enough to make him aware of how certain things looked. He had brothers who trusted him, and some enemies who respected him, and a reputation built on the idea that Desert Iron handled things the right way. He did not handle things the right way because he was a good man. He handled things the right way because he was a man who had done things the wrong way and knew exactly what it cost. He turned onto his side. The AC rattled. The highway outside hummed. He went back the next morning. But he found a reason to be there. It wasn't a great reason, but it was enough. The diner on Gurley was only 4 blocks from the neighborhood, and a man could eat breakfast wherever he wanted, and riding through a residential street wasn't a crime. He told himself this was a reconnaissance, not a commitment. He had not committed to anything. He saw her at 7:50 a.m., walking to what he guessed was a bus stop at the end of the block, alone. Backpack that was too big for her, the straps cinched so tight they were digging into her shoulders. The long sleeves again, despite another day already promising to break 95 by 10. He parked at the corner and watched her walk. She walked close to the property lines, near the fences, the way people walked when they'd learned that the middle of the space wasn't safe, when they'd learned to keep something solid nearby. She didn't look up. She didn't look around. She moved with the specific purposeful invisibility of someone who had practiced not being noticed because being noticed had consequences. He felt something in his sternum, old and heavy, like something that had been stored there a long time. He did not follow her to the bus stop. He drove back to the diner and ordered coffee and sat at the corner booth again and called Rudy. "I need a background check," he said when Rudy picked up. "Discreet." There was a pause. Rudy had been with the club long enough to know that when Hank used the word discreet, what he meant was, "I'm doing something the club hasn't sanctioned yet, and I need you to not ask questions until I'm ready to explain." "Name?" Rudy said. "Sandra Voss, Prescott, and a male associate, Rom15. Oh, green. I didn't get the plates, but it's a local registration probably." "That's thin." "I know." "How long are you in Prescott?" Hank looked at the coffee. "I don't know yet." Another pause, then, "Hank? I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't. You were about to." "I was going to say be careful," Rudy said. "Whatever you're doing up there, just be careful." He hung up and drank his coffee and looked out the window at Gurley Street in the early morning, the day already heating up, the light flat and white and unforgiving, and thought about a 7-year-old girl walking close to fences and a voice that said, "You are more trouble than you are worth." He was going to find out exactly what was happening in that house on Copper Basin Road. He didn't know yet what he would do with what he found, but 47 years of living as the kind of man who notices what other people don't, who carries the weight of things left undone. It had never led him anywhere good when he walked away from what he saw. He wasn't walking away. The question was what that was going to cost him. He found out 4 days later when he was sitting in his truck. He'd switched to the truck he kept in a storage unit in Prescott from before, the pickup he used when he needed to be less visible than the road king made him, watching the house, and the front door opened, and the man came out dragging Lily by the upper arm. Not dragging her badly. Not the kind of thing that would make a neighbor call anyone. Just the grip of someone who believed that a child's body was a thing to be managed, not a person to be spoken to. He walked her to the truck. She got in. She sat with her hands in her lap and her head down and her face doing nothing at all. Her face doing nothing at all was the worst thing he'd seen in a long time. The truck pulled out. Hank started his engine. He was 3 cars back when his phone buzzed. Rudy. The background check had come through. Hank read the text at a red light and felt the specific cold that came not from shock but from confirmation, the cold of finding out you were right about something you'd hoped you were wrong about. Glenn Prater, 38. Sandra Voss's boyfriend, in the house 6 months. 2 priors, one disorderly, one assault charge from 2019 that had been reduced to a misdemeanor. And one Child Protective Services report filed 8 months ago by a teacher at Lily's school, which had been investigated, deemed inconclusive and closed. Investigated. Inconclusive. Closed. The light turned green. Hank drove, and the cold in his chest became something harder and more deliberate, and he started thinking about what it meant to do this right when the systems built to do it right had already failed once, and the girl in that truck ahead of him had learned to make her face do nothing at all. Hank followed the green Ram for 11 blocks before it pulled into a Walmart parking lot on Willow Creek Road, which was either an errand or a coincidence, and he'd stopped believing in coincidences around the same time he stopped believing in easy solutions. He parked 4 rows back and watched through the windshield. Glenn Prater got out first. He moved the way certain men moved, not hurried, not slow, just with the low-grade authority of someone who expected the space around him to accommodate. He went to the passenger side and opened the door, and Lily climbed down, and she did it fast, the way children learned to do things fast when fast was safer than slow. They went inside. Hank sat with the engine off and the August heat building inside the cab and thought about the CPS report, filed 8 months ago. Teacher at Lily's school, which meant someone had seen something, had taken the risk of saying something, had done the thing the system asked people to do, and the system had looked at it and said inconclusive and walked away. He thought about the word inconclusive, what it meant, what it required. The threshold between a child being in danger and a child being in documented danger, the bureaucratic gap between what was real and what could be proven on a form, and how many children lived their whole lives in that gap. He got out of the truck. He didn't go inside the Walmart. He leaned against the front panel with his arms crossed and watched the parking lot and called a number he hadn't called in 3 years. It rang 4 times. Then, Mercer. Carmen, he said. A pause. Not surprised. Carmen Delgado didn't do surprised, she did assessment. She was a former Maricopa County investigator, semi-retired now, doing freelance work that she described as consulting, and which mostly meant she helped people navigate systems that were designed to be unnavigable. He'd met her through a mutual friend 8 years ago, and they'd worked together twice, both times on situations that required someone who understood both the letter of the law and the specific ways the letter of the law failed living people. "You're in trouble," she said. It wasn't a question. "Not me." That's always what you say right before you're in trouble. "I need advice. I'm watching a situation and I need to know the right channels. CPS report filed 8 months ago, closed as inconclusive. There's a child and there's a man in her house, and the physical signs are..." He stopped, organized his words. "Clear. Clear how?" "Sleeves in 104-degree weather, a bruise on her neck, the way she moves." He heard Carmen's breath shift, something settling in her, the professional attention that was different from casual concern. "How old? 7? Maybe 8? You have a name." "Lily. Last name Voss or Prater, I don't know yet. Prescott. And you're there because..." I stopped for gas. Another pause. Longer. He could hear her thinking. "Hank, tell me you're not doing anything stupid. I'm standing in a parking lot. That's not the same as not doing anything stupid." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm calling you." Carmen called him back 40 minutes later with a name, the CPS caseworker who'd handled the original report. A woman named Patricia Osei, Yavapai County Child Protective Services, currently managing a caseload that was, according to Carmen's sources, approximately 3 times what the state guidelines recommended. "She's not a bad worker," Carmen said. "She's an overworked worker. There's a difference. Can she be approached?" "Carefully, and not by you." "Why not by me?" "Because you're a 6'2" man with club ink and a president's patch who just spent a week following a 7-year-old girl around Prescott. Hank. Think about how that looks." He thought about how it looked. She was right. She was almost always right, which was why he called her. "I can reach out," Carmen said. "Frame it as a concerned community member providing additional information. But I need specifics, documentation, dates, times, what you observed, not what you think, not what your gut says, what you actually saw." "I have it." "How detailed?" "Military detailed." A pause. "Okay," she said. "Send it to me. All of it. And Hank, I know. Stay back from the house." He said he would. He meant it when he said it. He was back at the Desert Iron Clubhouse in Wickenburg by 6 that evening, which was a 90-minute ride he did in 70 minutes because the road was empty and the desert was open and the Road King needed to stretch. Or he did. It was sometimes hard to tell the difference. The clubhouse was a converted machine shop on the south edge of town. Corrugated metal walls, a bar along the back, a pool table that listed slightly to the left and which everyone had simply adjusted their game to over the years. 3 bikes in the lot when he pulled in. The sound of the evening news on a TV that nobody was watching. Rudy was at the bar with a beer and a folder. He looked up when Hank came in, read his face the way he'd been reading it for 6 years. "Put the beer down." "Sit," Rudy said. "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't. Sit anyway." Hank sat on the stool beside him. The bartender, Tommy Reeves, Desert Iron for 4 years, 26 years old, the youngest member, and the one most likely to do something useful with his life if the club didn't become a permanent address, put a coffee in front of him without being asked. Rudy slid the folder across. Hank opened it. Glenn Prater's record, more detailed than the text summary. The 2019 assault charge, a former girlfriend. Charges filed and then withdrawn, the classic pattern, the one that prosecutors and social workers and everyone in the system could see and couldn't act on because the system required the victim's cooperation and the victim had learned not to cooperate. 2DU is in the preceding decade, a restraining order from 2016, also involving a former girlfriend, which had expired. The picture was not the picture of a dangerous man. It was the picture of a man who had learned how not to cross lines in ways that stuck. That was worse. Who else knows? Hank asked. Just me? Rudy took his beer. What's the play? Legitimate channels first. I've got someone working the CPS angle. I need the situation documented. What I've seen, dates, timeline, legal. Rudy nodded slowly. The slow nod was his processing nod. Counsel's going to want to know what you're spending time on up there. I know. They're not going to love it. Hank wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. I know. A kid, Hank. Rudy said it quietly, not as an accusation, as a thing he was naming, so it was named. If this goes wrong, if you make one move that looks wrong, it won't. You don't know that. No, Hank said, I don't. But I know what happens if I walk away from this, and I'm not doing that. Rudy looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that contained a history, 6 years of it, more than 6 years if you counted before the patches, which Rudy did. Then he picked up his beer. Council meeting's Friday, he said. You should be there. I'll be there. And Hank? Hank looked at him. Whatever you do up there, Rudy said, don't do it alone. The Friday council meeting was at 7 p.m., and it went badly before it started. There were 8 officers around the table, Hank at the head, Rudy to his left, then Sergeant-at-Arms Del Forsyth, Treasurer Big Carl Muncie, Road Captain Vic Salazar, and 3 chapter representatives who'd driven in from Mesa, Flagstaff, and Yuma. The Flagstaff rep was a man named Aaron Drift, 44, who had been with Desert Iron longer than anyone except Hank, and who had the specific energy of a man who believed that his experience entitled him to define the club's direction. Aaron Drift had never liked that Hank got the president's vote. He'd been professional about it, mostly. Hank laid out the situation, kept it clean, kept it factual, the way Carmen had said. What he'd observed, when, the background check, the CPS history, the contact with Carmen Delgado, the plan to work through legitimate channels to trigger a reinvestigation. He finished. The table was quiet for a moment. Then Aaron said, So you spent a week in Prescott following a kid around and you're telling us the club's going to be involved in this because... Why exactly? Because I'm asking, Hank said. That's not a reason. It's the reason I'm giving. Del Forsyth, who was 53 and had the face of a man who'd seen every argument go bad twice, shifted in his chair. What are you asking for exactly, Hank? Resources? Manpower? What does club involvement look like here? Right now, just awareness. I want the Prescott chapter on standby, quiet standby, nothing visible. I want a line of communication to Carmen Delgado if she needs ground support. I want the council to know what's happening so that if it escalates, we're not starting from zero. And if it escalates, how? This was Big Carl. Direct, practical. The question of a man who managed the club's finances and thought in terms of exposure. What does escalation look like? Because there's a version of this where Prescott chapter shows up somewhere and suddenly we're the story, not the guy hurting the kid. Us. That's why we're doing it right, Hank said. You keep saying that, Aaron said. Doing it right. I want to know what right looks like to you, because right to me looks like staying in our lane and not making this club the subject of a police investigation because our president has a personal interest in a custody situation in Prescott. The table got quiet in a specific way, the kind of quiet that had weight to it. Hank looked at Aaron. Aaron looked back. Personal interest, Hank said. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. You're failing. I'm asking a question the council needs answered. Aaron leaned forward. He wasn't a small man, broad across the shoulders, hands that had worked construction for 20 years before he'd taken over the Flagstaff chapter. The kind of physical presence that made people listen. Why this kid, Hank? Why this situation? We don't do this. We've never done this. And you coming back from a week of surveillance in Prescott, asking the club to back a play that could bring CPS, cops, and press down on us, I want to know what's driving that. I think I have the right to ask. The silence stretched. It was Rudy who broke it, and he did it quietly, without looking at Aaron. Because he saw something he recognized, Rudy said, and that's the only reason a man with his history needs. Aaron looked at Rudy, then back at Hank. Something shifted in his expression, not softened but recalibrated. The calculation of a man who understood that there was territory here he wasn't going to win. I want clear parameters, Aaron said. I want it documented that the club's involvement is advisory and non-physical unless there's an imminent threat. I want everything run through legitimate channels, and I want a weekly update to this council. Agreed, Hank said. And if this turns into something that creates legal exposure for this club, then I take the responsibility, not the club. Another silence. Dell nodded once. Big Carl wrote something in his notebook. The 3 chapter reps looked at each other and didn't object. Aaron sat back. He didn't say agreed. He just stopped arguing, which was the closest thing to agreement he offered. Backend. The first mistake happened 11 days later, and it wasn't Hank's. It was Tommy Reeves, 26 years old, who had become peripherally involved because Hank had made the mistake of letting him come along on one observation trip to Prescott when Hank needed a second vehicle. Someone to cover the other exit from the neighborhood while Hank watched the front. Tommy was young, and he was earnest, and he had a sister who had grown up in a bad situation that he didn't talk about often but which Hank had understood from the first time they'd spoken. Tommy had driven past the house, and Glenn Prater had been in the yard, and they had made eye contact, and Tommy had held it a beat too long. He told Hank about it that evening, at the gas station in Prescott where they had agreed to meet, standing in the same spot where Hank had first seen Lily reach for the water bottle. And the look on Tommy's face was the look of a man who already knew he'd done something wrong and was doing the accounting. He looked at me, Tommy said, and I couldn't look away. I tried. I couldn't. Hank was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had a pressure in it. "You make your truck?" Hank said. "I don't know, maybe. Probably." "Did you have Desert Iron anything visible?" "No, no patches, nothing on the vehicle. I was playing." Hank let out a slow breath. "Okay." "I'm sorry, Hank. I know you're sorry." He wasn't harsh about it. He said it the way you said things to someone who'd made an honest mistake that had real consequences. "Go home. Don't come back up here without my specific call." Tommy left. Hank sat in his truck and thought about what a man like Glenn Prater did when he thought someone was watching him. The calculation, the adjustment, the ways a man who had spent years staying just below the threshold of consequence adapted when he felt observed. He called Carmen. "It may be burned," he said. "How burned?" Someone made inadvertent eye contact with the subject, plain vehicle, no club identification. But the subject is cautious. He's got the profile of someone who's careful about exposure. Carmen was quiet for a moment. "That may not be the worst thing," she said. "How?" "Because Patricia Osei agreed to a meeting. Not official. She can't make it official yet. Not until I give her something that reopens the file. But she'll listen. If the subject is spooked and changes behavior, that's a change in behavior that can be documented. Or he does something to the kid before anyone can move." The silence that followed had a different quality. The kind that meant Carmen was taking the thing seriously, which she always did, but was also calibrating what she could say versus what she felt. "I'm going to push the meeting to tomorrow," she said. "I'm going to bring everything you gave me." "What does she need?" "More medical. She needs something that can establish a pattern. Has the girl been to a school nurse? Has there been a doctor visit?" "I don't know." "Find out. Carefully." He said he would. He sat in the parking lot after he hung up and felt the particular weight of a situation that was moving faster than the systems around it could accommodate. A child on one side and a process on the other, and a shrinking window between them, and tried to figure out who he could talk to that wouldn't make things worse. He found the answer at 7 a.m. the next morning in the form of a woman named Ruth Escobar, who lived in the house directly across the street from the Voss residence, and who was watering her roses at an hour that suggested she'd been awake since 5. He introduced himself as a concerned neighbor, technically accurate from a distance, if you didn't ask too many questions about which neighborhood. Ruth Escobar was 67, widowed, sharp-eyed, and the kind of woman who had watched her street for decades, with the attention of someone who understood that neighborhoods were ecosystems, and that what happened in one house eventually reached every house. She knew about Lily. She said it without preamble, once she'd understood what he was carefully asking, once she'd taken his measure with the same kind of rapid assessment that Lily had used in the gas station. The recognition of someone who had learned that strangers were always an equation. She looked at him for a long time. His ink, his bearing, the weathered quality of a man who'd spent a lot of time in difficult places. The man, Ruth said. She was talking about Glenn. She didn't use his name. He moved in February. Before him. Before him it was just Sandra and Lily, and it wasn't good, but it wasn't... She stopped, looked at her roses. It got worse in February. You file anything? I called the school. I talked to a woman at the district office. She said she'd look into it. Ruth's jaw tightened. I don't believe she did. What have you seen? She told him. She was careful about it, clinical in the way of someone who'd turned it over many times. The time she'd seen Lily in the yard and then seen her called inside quickly when Glenn appeared. The morning 3 weeks ago, when Lily had waited at the bus stop and Ruth had been able to see her from her kitchen window, and the girl had been holding her left arm differently, not moving it right, tucked against her body. The time she'd heard shouting from the house at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, and then silence that felt worse than the shouting. Hank sat in Ruth's kitchen and drank the coffee she put in front of him and wrote everything down in the small notebook he'd been keeping since this started. Dates, times, specific observations. Carmen's voice in his head. Not what you think, what you actually saw. When he left, Ruth said, Are you going to help her? Yes, he said. And he meant it with the kind of certainty that came from having nothing else to do with your life that mattered more. Who are you? Ruth said, not suspicious anymore, more like recognizing something she didn't have a full name for. Just someone who noticed, he said. She nodded. It seemed to be enough. It was on the drive back to Wickenburg that his phone rang. Rudy. But not Rudy's voice. It was Aaron Drift, which meant Aaron was at the clubhouse, which meant something had happened. You need to come in, Aaron said. What happened? The Prescott police called the clubhouse. Hank felt the cold settle in his chest. What? Someone filed a report, Aaron said. A man fitting your description, and I'm quoting here, has been observed conducting surveillance of a residential property on Copper Basin Road over a period of approximately 2 weeks. A pause. The report was filed by Glenn Prater. The road stretched out ahead of him, empty and flat and bright. He drove without speaking. Hank. Aaron's voice had something in it now that wasn't contempt, wasn't calculation, something closer to warning, the kind that came from a man who had his own experience with being the one the law looked at first. This just became a problem for the club. I know. No, I don't think you do. A breath. They're going to come ask questions, and when they do, everything you've built, the CPS angle, the witness documentation, the whole careful structure of this, it falls apart if you look like a predator watching a child, Hank. Do you understand what I'm telling you? He understood. He understood exactly. Because Glenn Prater had just done the most effective thing he could possibly do. He'd turned the watcher into the watched. And if the Prescott PD looked into Hank Mercer's 2 weeks of activity in their city, the story that emerged would not be the story of a man protecting a child. It would be the story of a club president who had been conducting unauthorized surveillance of a 7-year-old girl. And Lily would still be in that house. And nobody would believe anything he said next. He gripped the wheel. The desert blurred past him. His phone buzzed. Carmen. He let it ring. Then it buzzed again. A text from a number he didn't recognize. Prescott area code. He pulled over on the shoulder and looked at the screen. The text was 4 words. He knows about you. He stared at it. 4 words from a number he didn't have, couldn't trace in the 3 seconds he had before the implications landed. And the only person in Prescott who might send him a warning like that, the only person who knew he existed in relation to this situation and who might have reason to reach out, was Ruth Escobar. Which meant Glenn Prater hadn't just filed a police report. He'd been to see his neighbor. And Ruth, 67 years old with roses and a widow's careful attention to her street, had just made herself visible in a situation where visibility had consequences that Hank could now see clearly, spreading out in front of him like a road narrowing to a single lane with no room to stop and no way back. He called Ruth back from the shoulder of the highway with the desert heat pressing against the windows and a semi blowing past hard enough to rock the truck. She picked up on the first ring. "Are you safe?" he said. "He knocked on my door 20 minutes ago." Her voice was steady, the steadiness of someone holding themselves very still so they wouldn't shake. "He wanted to know if I'd been talking to anyone about the family, about Lily." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know what he was talking about." A pause. "He stood in my doorway for a long time, Hank. He didn't say anything else. He just stood there. And then he left." Hank understood the visit. It wasn't about information. It was about communication. Glenn Prater had stood in Ruth Escobar's doorway for a long time to communicate one thing. "I know where you are. I know you exist. Think carefully about what you do next." "Lock your doors," Hank said. "Don't open for anyone tonight. I'm sending someone." "You don't have to. I'm sending someone." He hung up and called Rudy and gave him Ruth's address and told him to get a prospect over there to sit outside. Plain vehicle, nothing visible, just a warm body between an old woman and a man who made visits to communicate things without words. Then he drove. He drove fast, not toward Wickenburg and not toward Prescott, but north on 89 with the windows down and the hot air screaming through the cab, and the kind of focused blankness that came over him when the situation had clarified past the point of options into the narrower territory of what has to happen now. Glenn had filed the police report. That was the board. That was where they were. Everything Hank had built, 2 weeks of careful documentation, Ruth's testimony, Carmen's relationship with Patricia Osei, the legitimate channel approach that the council had approved and that Aaron Drift had reluctantly sanctioned. All of it now existed inside a frame that Glenn Prater had constructed. A frame that said, "There is a suspicious man watching my home and my family. And the child in that frame was Lily, and the family in that frame was Glenn's, and the suspicious man was Hank." He pulled off at a rest stop and sat for a moment and pressed his palms against his eyes. Then he called Carmen. She answered on the second ring. She'd already heard, not about the police report specifically, but about the movement on Prater's end. Her source inside the Yavapai County office had flagged an inquiry that had come through channels earlier that afternoon, someone running a check on Hank's name and the Desert Iron MC in connection with a complaint. "It went up fast," Carmen said, "faster than a normal neighbor complaint. Someone helped it move." "Who?" "I don't know yet, but the speed tells me Prater has a connection somewhere, someone who can push paper for him." A pause. "That changes things." "How bad?" "Bad enough that Patricia Osei called me 2 hours ago and said she needs to pause the meeting until this gets clarified. She can't be seen taking a meeting with someone whose associate is currently the subject of a complaint, Hank. That's her career." "So the reinvestigation stalls?" "Yes." "While Lily is still in that house?" "Yes." Carmen's voice was flat. Not cold, Carmen wasn't cold, but stripped of everything that wasn't necessary. "I need you to tell me something honestly. Ask. In all the time you were watching that house, all the documentation, is there anything that could be read the wrong way? Anything that could be made to look like something other than what it is?" He thought. He went through it the way he went through everything, systematically, without mercy toward himself, the way the Corps had taught him, and the years after had reinforced. 2 weeks of observation, mostly from public spaces, the street, the diner, the parking lot. The one night at the rest stop, 2 blocks from the house, Ruth's kitchen, the gas station. "No," he said. "You're sure?" "Carmen, I have to ask." "I know. I'm sure." She let out a slow breath. "Then we wait for the complaint to be reviewed. It'll take 48 hours minimum. In that time, you go home. You stay away from Prescott entirely. You let me work it from this end. And Lily, is in the same situation she was in before you started watching, Carmen said. Which is terrible, which is true. But Hank, you going back there right now doesn't make her safer. It makes everything worse. He knew she was right. He sat in the rest stop with the engines on the highway and the flat, empty desert and the specific misery of a man who could see the thing that needed doing and couldn't do it. 48 hours, he said. At least. He drove home. The clubhouse that night had the atmosphere of a place that knew something was coming and was choosing how to wait for it. Rudy was at the bar. Del Forsyth was in the back with two members from the Wickenburg chapter playing cards with the concentration of men who needed something for their hands to do. Tommy Reeves was not there, which was correct. Hank had told him to stay away until further notice, and Tommy had the sense to listen. Aaron Drift was there. He was sitting at the council table with a cup of coffee and the folder from the original background check and the posture of a man who had been waiting. Hank sat across from him. Aaron looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me about your daughter." Hank hadn't expected that. "What?" "Maya. Tell me about her." "That's not—" "I think it is." Aaron kept his voice level, not aggressive, something more uncomfortable, considered. "I think this situation with the girl in Prescott is connected to something about Maya, and I think you know that. And I think if I understand that, I understand why you're making the decisions you're making and whether those decisions are going to hold up when the pressure gets bigger." The bar was quiet enough that Hank could hear the refrigerator unit behind the counter and Dell's cards on the table in the back room. "She's 19, Hank said. Environmental science at NAU. She doesn't call." "Why?" "Because I was gone for most of the years that mattered." He said it flat. No self-pity, no editorial, just the fact of it. 2 deployments, then the years after that they weren't good years. And by the time I was someone she could have had a father from, she'd already built the life she was going to build without one. Aaron nodded. Not sympathetically, just registering the information. "So when you see Lily, it's not the same thing." "I didn't say it was the same thing. I'm saying it's connected." Aaron picked up his coffee. "I'm not using it against you. I want you to understand that. I'm asking because I need to know if you're going to hold together when this gets worse. And it's going to get worse." Hank looked at him across the table. The light above the council table was harsh, the kind of light that found every line in a face, and Aaron Drift at 44 had the lines of a man who had made hard calls and lived with them. "Why do you care?" Hank said. "You didn't want this." "I didn't want it handled the way I thought you were going to handle it," Aaron said. "I was wrong about that. You've been careful." He set down the coffee. "But there's something you're not seeing, or you're seeing it and you don't want to say it yet." "Say it." "This isn't just a man hurting a kid anymore." Aaron slid the folder to the center of the table. He opened it to a page Hank hadn't seen. A supplemental Rudy must have added. Rudy pulled Prater's financial history. Informal, not official. He's been in Prescott 6 months, and before that he was in Kingman. Before Kingman, Tucson. Before Tucson, he tapped the page. 3 years in Florence. Florence, the state prison. "What was the conviction?" Hank said. "That's the thing," Aaron said. "There's a gap in the record. The conviction itself is sealed. Rudy's contact couldn't get to it through normal channels. What he could find is that Prater served 32 months and that the sealing was requested by the prosecution, not the defense." Hank looked at the folder. "Prosecution requests sealing when the subject cooperated," Aaron said. "When the subject gave something up." Gave someone up. The quiet in the bar was a different quality now. "He's an informant," Hank said. "Was. Potentially still is." Aaron leaned forward, which means the police report he filed today may not be just a man protecting himself. It may be a man making a call to people who owe him, or who he owes, and the speed with which that complaint moved up the chain. "Someone helped it move," Hank said. Carmen's words. "Someone helped it move," Aaron confirmed. "And that means we're not just looking at a CPS case anymore. We're looking at a situation where the person hurting that child may have law enforcement cover, which means the legitimate channel approach is going to hit a wall." "Has already hit a wall," Aaron said. "And when it hits the wall, whoever is on Prater's side is going to look at what we've been doing and they're going to come at us. Not just you, the club. Hank sat very still. Outside, the desert night had cooled enough that the air coming through the open side door was almost bearable. And somewhere beyond the parking lot, the highway hummed with the sound of people going places, and the entire structure of the last 2 weeks. The careful approach, the documentation, the legitimate channels, the council approval, all of it, was sitting on a foundation that had just been identified as rotten. "What do you need from me?" Aaron said. Hank looked at him. "I thought you wanted this to stop." "I want the club protected," Aaron said. "That's always been my position. I thought protecting the club meant not getting involved. I'm reconsidering." He held Hank's gaze. "If there's law enforcement cover on this man and we back off, and something happens to that girl, that is also a consequence the club lives with. That is also something I have to look at in the mirror." It was the most honest thing Aaron Drift had said to him in 8 months. Hank nodded. "I need to know who Prater talked to in 2021, who he gave up, and I need to know if that connection is still active." "Rudy's already on it," Aaron said, "but it'll take time. We may not have time." "I know." The call came at 2:17 in the morning. Hank was asleep, barely, the thin, restless sleep of someone whose mind hadn't agreed to stop, and he was off the bed and to the phone in the way that men who'd done multiple deployments always woke up, completely and immediately, no gradient between sleep and alert. It was Carmen. "Something happened," she said, and the way she said it made his stomach drop. "Lily." "Not Lily." A breath. "Patricia Osi." He waited. "She was in a car accident an hour ago. Route 69 coming home from a late case visit. She's alive. She's at Yavapai Regional. She's stable. They're saying it was a deer strike." Carmen paused. "It may have been a deer strike. But it happened 40 minutes after she called me and told me she'd made a decision, that she was going to push the Voss case through regardless of the complaint, that she'd looked at everything I sent her and she wasn't going to wait anymore." Carmen's voice was very controlled, the control of someone who was managing something very large. "And now she's in the hospital with a concussion and a broken collarbone, and the case is sitting on her desk with nobody to move it." Hank was standing in the dark of the motel room he'd come back to in Wickenburg, and the AC was rattling its familiar rattle, and he was looking at his own hands in the thin light from the window. "Carmen," he said, "I know. This is past what I thought this was." "Yes. If someone has the reach to move a complaint through law enforcement channels, and then—" He stopped, said it quietly, because saying it out loud was a door you didn't walk back through. "If that's what happened to Patricia Ose, this man is protected by something significant." "Yes," Carmen said again. "Hank, I need you to hear me. Whatever this is, whatever Prater is connected to, it is bigger than one man hurting one child. The child is real, and her situation is real, and I'm not dismissing that. But what is around her is something you were not prepared for when you walked into that gas station 3 weeks ago." He already knew it. He'd felt it moving under the situation the way water moved under ice, present, powerful, invisible, until you put the wrong foot down. "What do I do?" he said. Not helplessly, the question of a man assessing resources. "Tonight, nothing. Tomorrow, I need you to come to Prescott, not to watch anything. I have someone I need you to meet, someone who knows what Prater is and who he's connected to." Another pause. "It's going to change how you see this." "How?" She hesitated. Carmen Delgado did not hesitate. In 6 years of knowing her, he had never heard her hesitate before she spoke. "The child," she said. "Lily. I've been doing some digging since tonight, since the accident. I needed to understand how Prater ended up in that house, with Sandra Voss in Prescott. The case file, the sealed conviction. I have someone who got deeper into it than Rudy's contact could." "And?" "The conviction was a trafficking case," Carmen said. "Human trafficking. Prater gave up 3 members of a network operating out of Tucson in exchange for reduced charges and identity management, which is why the record is sealed and why he has the connections he has." Her voice was precise and flat and careful. "And the network he gave up? They folded. Officially. But networks don't fold, Hank. They restructure. He felt the ice under his feet. The children in the original trafficking case, Carmen said. The victims. There were 7. The youngest was 8 years old. A breath. And one of the cooperating pieces of evidence that helped convict the network members, a financial record, an address, a pattern of movement, was provided by a woman named Sandra Voss, who was interviewed in 2021 as a peripheral associate. The AC rattled. The highway hummed. Sandra Voss, Hank said. Slowly, like he was checking the weight of each word. Glenn Prater and Sandra Voss were connected before Prescott, Carmen said. Before this house, before this life they appear to be living. The story they are telling, that he's a boyfriend, that he moved in February, that this is a domestic situation. It's a cover, Hank said. I don't know exactly what it is, Carmen said, but I know it is not what it looks like. And I know that Lily, in that house, is not simply a child in a bad home situation. Her voice caught, just slightly, just once, the first crack in the professional surface. I think she may have been placed there deliberately. Hank sat down on the edge of the bed. The room was very quiet. He thought about Lily in the gas station with her hands on the water bottle, the threat assessment in her eyes, the bruise on her neck, the practiced invisibility, the face that had learned to do nothing at all. He thought about a trafficking network that officially folded and unofficially restructured, and a man with law enforcement cover living in a house with a 7-year-old girl who moved close to fences. He thought about the teacher who had filed the CPS report 8 months ago. He thought about whether that teacher was still teaching. Carmen, he said. Yes. How long has Lily been in that house? A pause. 8 months. 8 months. The CPS report was filed 8 months ago. Glenn Prater moved in 8 months ago. And 8 months ago, someone had seen something, a teacher, an ordinary person doing the right thing, and the system had said inconclusive and the case had been closed. He was already there when the report was filed, Hank said. They were already in position, and the report got closed because someone made sure it got closed, Carmen said. Yes, that's what I think. He stood up. His whole body had the particular wired stillness of a man who has just understood the battlefield he is standing on and is calculating his next breath very carefully. I need to call my counsel, he said. Hank, her voice sharpened. You cannot go into that house. You cannot touch that man. If you do anything that gives them a reason to look at you, they will use it, and the case disappears and Lily disappears with it. Do you understand me? I understand you. Do you? Carmen. He said her name the way he'd said things in the field, to people who needed to hear that he was still thinking, still in control, still the person who could be trusted to not break things that couldn't be fixed. I hear everything you're telling me. I'm going to call my counsel. We're going to plan. We're going to do this right. She let out a slow breath. The person I need you to meet tomorrow. His name is Warren Toll. He's a former federal investigator. He left the Bureau under circumstances that are complicated, and he has a reason to care about this network that is personal and significant. He can give you the picture you don't have yet. A pause. And you're going to need that picture, Hank, because the thing you've been protecting Lily from, it is larger and it has more reach than anything I want to tell you over the phone. He said he'd be there. He hung up and stood in the dark room and felt the full weight of what he'd walked into 3 weeks ago in a gas station on Route 89, and the full weight of what a child in a house in Prescott was sitting inside, and the fact that he was now a man who knew too much to walk away and not enough to move forward. And the space between those two things was where everything dangerous lived. He called Rudy. Rudy answered in 2 rings. Awake. Rudy was always awake. Get Aaron, Hank said. Get Dell. Get everyone you trust. Nobody you're not sure of. Full counsel in the morning, 6 a.m. I don't care who has to drive. He paused. And Rudy, the prospect you sent to sit outside Ruth Escobar's house. Yeah. Tell him to stay awake all night. A silence. Then, that bad. It's worse than that, Hank said. It's worse than anything I thought it was going to be, and we have a 7-year-old girl in the middle of it, and no clear move, and maybe 12 hours before someone decides we know too much to be useful and starts managing us the way they managed Patricia Osi." The line was quiet. Then Rudy said, "I'll have everyone there at 6. Hank put the phone down and sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall and thought about all the things that were true now that he couldn't make untrue. And the one thing he was absolutely certain of in the cold clarity of 2:40 in the morning, he was not the same man who had stopped for gas on Route 89 3 weeks ago, and the road back to that man was gone, and the road forward went through whatever Warren Toll was going to tell him in the morning, and on the other side of that road was a little girl who had learned to make her face do nothing at all, and who deserved to learn something different. He did not sleep. He sat and he thought. And outside the desert held its vast, indifferent silence, and somewhere in Prescott, a house on Copper Basin Road sat with its lights off and its secrets intact, and a child breathing in the dark who did not know that the man who'd handed her a water bottle in a gas station was now sitting in a motel room 30 miles away, dismantling and rebuilding everything he thought he knew, preparing to become whatever he needed to become to bring her out of it. The 6 a.m. council meeting lasted 41 minutes and ended with Aaron Drift standing at the head of the table saying things Hank had never expected to hear him say. "Every chapter," Aaron said. "Every writer we can call. I want them on standby by noon." Rudy looked at Hank. Hank looked at Aaron. "You sure?" Hank said. "I was wrong about this," Aaron said. It came out flat and direct, the way certain men apologized, not with softness, but with action, with the weight of a decision that cost something. "I thought you were making this personal. I thought you were chasing something about Maya through this kid, and I thought that was going to get people hurt." He put both hands on the table. "I was right about the personal part. I was wrong about what it meant. So, every chapter, noon." Del Forsyth had not spoken since Hank finished laying out what Carmen had told him. He sat at the far end of the table with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the look of a man who had been in the military long enough to know that some information, once received, changed the moral architecture of everything around it. "The federal angle," Del said. "Warren Toll. You're meeting him when?" 9 a.m. Prescott. "You're not going alone." "Del, you're not going alone." Del said it the way he said things at the range when someone's grip was wrong. Not a suggestion, a correction. "Take Rudy. Take one prospect, plane vehicle. The rest of us hold here until you call." Hank nodded. "And Hank..." Del uncrossed his arms. He was 53 and had the face of a man who had outlived several versions of himself and understood the cost of each transition. "Whatever Toll tells you this morning, whatever the picture looks like, we move together or we don't move. You understand me?" "I understand." "Say it." "We move together." Del nodded once. That was the end of the meeting. Warren Toll was not what Hank expected. He was 58, small in the way of men who had once been larger and had the weight stripped from them by something other than time. Gray stubble, a flannel shirt that was too warm for August, wire-rimmed glasses that looked like they'd come from a pharmacy rack. He was sitting at a corner table in a diner on Montezuma Street when Hank and Rudy walked in at 8:57, and he was drinking tea, not coffee, and he had a laptop open and the look of a man who had been there since the place opened. He looked up. He took in Hank's cut, Rudy's size, the general presentation of two men who spent their lives in the particular gravity field of a motorcycle club. He didn't look nervous. He looked like a man calculating what he was going to have to explain and how much time it would take. "Mercer," he said, not a question. "Toll." They sat. Rudy stayed at the counter with a view of the door, which was the right call, which Toll acknowledged with a slight nod that said he understood the architecture of protective positioning. "Carmen told me you were careful," Toll said. "She doesn't say that about many people." "What did she tell you about the situation?" "Everything she had, which is most of what I already knew from a different direction." He turned the laptop slightly. On the screen was a document, dense with text, the kind of formatting that came from federal records. "I spent 11 years in organized crime division. The last 4 before I left were focused on a trafficking network operating across the I-40 corridor, Albuquerque to Flagstaff to Kingman to Barstow. Multiple cells. fluid structure, which made prosecution difficult. By 2020, we had enough to move on 3 members. He paused. Prater gave us those 3 members in exchange for reduction, sealing, and relocation management. Relocation management, Rudy said from the counter. Toll glanced at him. We helped him establish a new pattern of life, Prescott. The connection to Sandra Voss was pre-existing. They go back further than the case. She was a peripheral figure we decided not to prosecute. Cooperative witness, minimal culpability on paper. He picked up his tea. I left the Bureau 14 months ago, officially for health reasons. Actually because I found out the 3 convictions we got in 2021, the 3 men Prater gave us, 2 of them had their sentences commuted 18 months in. Quietly. While the network they were convicted of running was, as far as I can determine, still operational. Hank kept his face still. Someone inside the Bureau. Someone adjacent to the Bureau, possibly inside, possibly contracted. I haven't been able to identify the specific individual, which is why I'm sitting in a diner in Prescott instead of presenting this to a congressional oversight committee. Toll set down the tea. Lily Voss is Sandra's daughter from a previous relationship. The biological father is deceased, car accident, 3 years ago. Since his death, Sandra has been controlled by the network, not voluntarily or not entirely voluntarily. The line isn't clean. She is both a participant and a person in a constrained situation. He looked at Hank directly. Lily is being used as leverage against Sandra to ensure her continued cooperation. The diner was doing its morning business around them. Plates, coffee, the scrape of chairs, people going to work. And inside that ordinary noise, Hank sat very still and absorbed the information and felt it settle into the architecture of everything he'd been building for 3 weeks. Leverage for what? He said. Sandra has access to something the network needs, a financial record from the 2021 case, not the official record, a shadow document that maps the money movement in a way that implicates people who were never prosecuted, people with significant current exposure. Toll folded his hands on the table. They need her to give it up or destroy it. She's been refusing. Prater is the pressure mechanism. And Lily is the pressure on Sandra, Hank said. Yes. Rudy said something quiet in Spanish that Hank didn't fully catch but understood the emotional content of. How long? Hank said. How long has this been the situation? 8 months since Prater arrived. Toll's voice was level, the levelness of a man who had made himself speak about terrible things clearly, because clarity was the only tool he had left. I've been watching from a distance. I didn't have the ground presence to do anything that wouldn't tip the network and result in accelerated consequences for Lily and Sandra. He looked at Hank. Then Carmen called me and told me about a motorcycle club president who'd spent 2 weeks doing better surveillance on the house than I'd managed in 4 months. Hank looked at the laptop. What do you need? The financial record. If I can get it out of that house and into the right hands, not the Bureau, someone outside the compromised chain, it ends the network's leverage over Sandra. It removes Prater's reason for being there. And it gives us the predicate to move on the protection Prater has. He paused. But getting it means going into that house, which means knowing when the house is clear, which means ground presence, Hank said. Yes. Hank looked at him for a long moment. Toll looked back. Neither of them said what they were both calculating. The risk architecture of what was being proposed, the specific ways it could go wrong, the difference between the thing that had to happen and the thing that was legal. Sandra, Hank said, does she want out? Yes. Toll said it without hesitation. I made contact 6 weeks ago, indirect contact through a woman who delivers groceries to the street. Sandra knows I exist. She knows what I'm trying to do. She is... He stopped. Started again. She is a woman who made bad choices a long time ago and has been paying for them in ways that nobody would design as a justice system. She is trying to protect her daughter with the only leverage she has, and she is losing, and she knows it. The record, Rudy said. Where is it in the house? Sandra told my contact it's on a thumb drive, taped inside the false bottom of a toolbox in the garage. Toll glanced at Rudy. The garage is detached. Prater uses it for his truck maintenance. He's typically out of the house Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He does a delivery run, Prescott to Chino Valley, about 3 hours. Hank checked the date on his phone. Tuesday. Tomorrow was Tuesday. He called the full council at 11 a.m. from the parking lot of the diner, put the phone on speaker and laid it out. Everything Toll had said, the network, Sandra's situation, the thumb drive, the window. The line was quiet when he finished. Then Dell said, "Tuesday morning?" "Yes." "You need to get in and out of a garage in a 3-hour window while the network's man is gone and the woman in the house is cooperating." "Yes." "And if the window closes early, we deal with it." "With what resources?" "That's what I'm calling about." Hank leaned against the truck. The August sun was overhead, and the parking lot was hot enough to make the air shimmer, and he was tired in a way that was past physical, the specific tiredness of a man who had been running on clarity and necessity for too long. "I need people who can hold a perimeter. Not to do anything, not to threaten anyone, to be present, visible from the street, so that if Prater comes back early, or if someone in the network has eyes on the house, they see something that communicates that the situation has changed." "You want 400 bikers outside a house in Prescott," Aaron said. "I want them staged, not outside the house, 2 blocks out, 3 blocks out. Engines idling. Enough presence that the calculation changes for anyone thinking about making a move." A pause. "That's not nothing," Aaron said. That's a statement." "Yes," Hank said. "It is." Another silence. He could hear the group breathing. 8 men and women who had built something together and who were now being asked to commit it to a situation that was larger and more dangerous than anything the Desert Iron MC had been designed for. "How many can we call?" Dell asked. "Depending on who answers," Rudy said from beside Hank. 600, maybe more." "When do we need commitments?" "Tonight," Hank said, "so people can ride at first light." The line held its silence for a long moment. Then Aaron said, "Start calling. Boissamt." That night, Hank drove to Flagstaff. He didn't tell Rudy where he was going, which was the first time in 6 years he'd left without telling Rudy, and Rudy either didn't notice or understood and said nothing, which meant Rudy understood. He had Maya's address from the last Christmas card her mother had sent him. An automatic thing, a habit from when it mattered, a small domestic continuity that he'd held onto like it was a piece of something he couldn't replace. An apartment near campus, 2nd floor, the kind of building that housed students and young people who were figuring out who they were going to be. He sat in his truck outside for 20 minutes. Then he got out and went up. She answered on the 3rd knock. She was in pajama pants and a university sweatshirt, and her hair was down and she looked like him around the eyes and like her mother everywhere else, which was a fact he'd long since decided to accept as fair. She looked at him, and the series of expressions that moved across her face in 2 seconds would have taken a paragraph to catalog. Surprise, then something older and more complicated, then the careful neutral of a young woman who had decided a long time ago to manage her own emotional exposure. "Dad?" she said. Not warmly, not coldly, just his name and a fact. "I know it's late," he said. "I know I should have called. I needed to see you." A pause. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, reading, assessing, the threat assessment he'd recognized in a gas station 3 weeks ago, and which he now understood he'd given her directly and indirectly by being the kind of man whose presence required assessment. "Is something wrong?" she said. "Something might be wrong tomorrow," he said. "I wanted to see you tonight in case." She stepped back. Let him in. He sat on her couch and she sat across from him, and he told her some of it. Not everything, not the network, not the federal angle, but a girl in a house and what it had taken to do the right thing and what might happen tomorrow. She listened. She didn't interrupt. Maya had always been a good listener, which had come from her mother, and which he'd noticed with the specific grief of a parent who understood they'd contributed the wrong things to their child's development. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I wanted you to know what I was doing, in case." "You never used to do that." "No," he said. "I didn't." Another silence. She looked at her hands. He looked at the apartment, her books, her running shoes by the door, a coffee mug with a university logo, the evidence of a life she was building with intention and care. "Is she going to be okay?" Maya said. "The girl." "I'm going to make sure of it." Maya looked at him. Okay, she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was a 20-year-old woman extending the minimum amount of trust she had available in this moment, which was more than he had a right to expect and which he received with both hands. He drove back to Prescott at 1 a.m. and did not sleep. Tuesday morning arrived the way terrible mornings arrived. Ordinarily, birds. A convenience store on Route 89 with its lights on. The smell of asphalt cooling from the night. The particular Arizona light that was not gentle, that arrived like a statement. Rudy was already at the staging point, a church parking lot 4 blocks from Copper Basin Road, when Hank arrived at 7:15. Not a church lot because of any significance beyond the fact that it was large enough and empty enough on a Tuesday morning. 42 bikes were already there, more arriving. The sound of engines running and cutting out. The organized murmur of men and women who had ridden through the night from Mesa and Yuma and Flagstaff, standing in small groups, drinking coffee from gas station cups, checking phones. Dell was coordinating positions. Aaron was on the radio with the Flagstaff chapter, who were 2 minutes out. Tommy Reeves was there. Hank had called him back in, because Tommy needed to be there. Because what this was required, everyone who'd carried any part of it. Rudy handed Hank a coffee. Prater left at 6:40, Rudy said. Carmen's contact confirmed visual. He took 89 north toward Chino Valley. Sandra? In the house. She knows we're coming. Toll's contact reached her last night. Hank nodded. He looked at the staging lot. 60 riders now, more pulling in, engines ticking and cooling. The smell of exhaust and leather, and the particular masculine nervousness of people who had decided on something and were waiting to execute it. Warren Toll walked over. He was in the same flannel shirt. He was carrying a small case, the kind that held a laptop or recording equipment. The document, once I have it, goes directly to a former colleague in the AG's office, Toll said. She's been read in. She's been waiting for the predicate. He looked at the growing crowd of bikers. I didn't expect... They're here for the girl, Hank said. Not for you. Toll nodded. I understand. What's the timeline? We go in at 8. Sandra will unlock the side door to the garage. I retrieve the drive. We're out in under 10 minutes. He paused. And then we wait for it to move through the AG's office, which could take... How long? Hours. Or the right call to the right person makes it faster. He met Hank's eyes. I've been building this for 14 months. I know who to call. Hank turned to Rudy. When we go in, I want 4 riders on each approach road, not visible from the house, 1 block back. Engines on. Anyone who isn't supposed to be on this street at 8 a.m., I want to know about it in 30 seconds. Done. Rudy turned and started talking to Dell. At 7:50, Carmen called. Prescott PD got a call 20 minutes ago, she said. Anonymous tip. Suspicious activity on Copper Basin Road. They're sending a unit. Hank felt it. The cold, specific weight of the plan being read and countered. How long? Units en route. 8, 10 minutes. We're already in motion, he said. Hank? Carmen. He was already walking toward his bike, putting on his helmet, the thing narrowing to a single point of action. The unit arrives and sees 100 bikers staged legally on public streets doing nothing illegal. That's a traffic situation, not a crime scene. They can't move us. That's a thin line. It's the line we're on. He started the Road King. The sound of it turning over, the specific baritone of a 100-year-old American engine design made honest through decades of iteration, was answered immediately by the riders around him, engines firing in a cascade, the parking lot filling with controlled thunder. He put it in gear. The column moved out of the lot and onto the streets of Prescott in the early August morning. Not fast, not aggressive, just present. Rolling through the residential grid in a measured column that was its own statement, that required no explanation, that communicated simply by existing what it was and why it was there. By the time the lead bikes turned onto the approach roads to Copper Basin, the count was past 140 and still growing, the Yuma chapter coming in from the south and the Mesa riders threading through the neighborhood grid, and the sound of it was building into something that was felt in the chest before it was heard, a vibration that was not quite music and not quite thunder, but something between the two. Hank went around the back, he and Toll and Rudy. 3 vehicles, quiet approach, no engines idling. They parked a house away and walked. Sandra Voss opened the side garage door before they reached it. She was thin in a way that told a story. Mid-30s, the kind of face that had been pretty before it had been exhausted, with eyes that had the specific quality of someone who had been waiting for something to change for so long that they'd stopped being sure change was real. She looked at Hank. "You're the one she told me about," Sandra said. Hank paused. "Who?" "Ruth." Sandra looked at him. "Ruth Escobar. She told me a man had been asking about Lily. She said—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "She said he had kind eyes for someone so dangerous looking." Hank stood in the door of the garage with that information and felt the specific sensation of the world rearranging itself slightly, the way it did when you discovered that the things you thought you were doing alone had been observed by more people than you knew, had been communicated in ways you hadn't authorized, had built into something larger than your own intention. "Is she okay?" he said. "Ruth?" "She's okay. She called me 2 days ago." Sandra's eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She was holding it hard, the way people held things when they couldn't afford to let go. "She said to trust you." Toll moved past them both into the garage. He went to the toolbox, old, red, against the back wall, and crouched and started working the false bottom. His hands were steady. Rudy stood at the door, watching the street. Hank looked at Sandra. "Lily," he said. "Where is she?" "School. I made sure she went today. I told her—" Sandra stopped. "I told her today was going to be a good day. I don't know if that was the right thing to say." "It was the right thing," Hank said. Toll made a sound, quiet, controlled relief, and stood with a thumb drive in his hand. Black, small, the specific insignificance of an object that contained something enormous. And then Rudy said, "We've got a problem." He was looking at his phone. His face had the expression of a man receiving information he had prepared himself for and found, upon receiving it, to be worse than prepared. "Prater," Rudy said. He turned around. Carmen's contact just made him on 89 southbound. He looked up. "He's 8 minutes out." 8 minutes. Toll was already on his phone, moving toward the door, the drive in his hand and his voice low and rapid. "I need you active right now. This is the material. I'm sending you the location. I need a marshal's team in Prescott in the next—" And his voice faded as he went out the door toward his car. Sandra was not moving. Hank looked at her. "You need to go inside. Lock the door. Do not come out until—" "He'll know," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "The second he sees the garage. He'll know something happened, and he will." She stopped, pressed her hand over her mouth, got control of it. "What I'm saying is, when he finds out, I need Lily not to be in this house." Hank understood. "Where is her school?" "Prescott Valley, Jefferson Elementary. She gets out at—" "We'll have someone there," he said. "She won't come home today." Something moved through Sandra's face. The specific expression of a mother who has been holding her child in the path of something terrible and is being offered, for the first time, the possibility of moving them out of the way. It was not relief. It was too enormous for relief. It was something that didn't have a clean word. "Go inside," Hank said. "Lock the door." She went. He walked out of the garage and looked at the street, where the sound of the Desert Iron MC was settling into the neighborhood like weather, like something that had become part of the landscape before anyone had time to argue with it. Riders positioned on the approach roads with their engines running and their silence, the specific silence of people who had decided on something and were waiting for the thing to arrive. 6 minutes. He got on his phone and called Dell. "School pickup," he said. "Jefferson Elementary, Prescott Valley. Tommy goes. Plain vehicle, no patches. He talks to the office. He says he's a family friend authorized by the mother. Her name is Sandra Voss." He paused. "The girl's name is Lily." "Done," Dell said. "Tommy's rolling." He put the phone in his pocket and stood on Copper Basin Road and felt the August morning around him and listened to the sound of hundreds of engines, hundreds of people who had ridden through the night because he'd asked, because Rudy had called, because the word had gone out through the network of a motorcycle club. And what came back was this presence, this specific human gravity, this statement that the street made simply by containing it. And in the distance, coming south on 89, he heard a different engine, a Ram 1500, dark green. Glenn Prater, 5 minutes out, coming back to a house where the thing he'd been protecting was gone, where the leverage was in the hands of a former federal investigator already on the phone with the state attorney general's office, where the street outside held something that could not be argued with or intimidated or filed a complaint against. Hank stood in the middle of the road and waited, and the engines around him ran on. And somewhere in Prescott Valley, a little girl named Lily was sitting in a classroom learning something that was not survival, and she did not yet know that the day her mother had promised her was going to be a good one was already keeping its word. The green truck turned onto Copper Basin Road. It slowed. It stopped. Glenn Prater sat in his idling truck and looked at what was in front of him. The street, the riders, the stillness of 140 people who had decided on something. And in the distance, Hank could see him, see the silhouette behind the glass doing its own calculation, the rapid threat assessment of a man who had spent his life reading rooms and exits and finding the angle that kept him safe. There was no angle. Hank started walking toward the truck. Behind him, the engines ran and the riders sat, and the August light came down hard on all of it, and Glenn Prater's hand moved inside the cab of his truck to something Hank couldn't see, and Hank kept walking because the distance between them was closing and the moment was here, and everything that had built for 3 weeks, every observation, every call, every council meeting, every mile ridden through the night by people who trusted him, was converging on this 30 feet of asphalt in a residential neighborhood in Prescott, Arizona, on an ordinary Tuesday morning that was not going to be ordinary for anyone standing in it. Glenn Prater did not have a gun. What his hand had moved to inside the cab was his phone, and by the time Hank had closed the 30 feet of asphalt between them, Prater had his window down and the phone at his ear and was talking to someone in the rapid, low cadence of a man calling in a marker he wasn't sure would cover the debt. Hank stood at the driver's window. Prater looked at him. The calculation in his eyes was still running. Hank could see it, the rapid inventory of options. But the inventory was coming up short, and they both knew it. Behind Hank, the street held its weight. Engines idling, riders sitting, the specific stillness of people who were not doing anything that could be characterized as threatening, and whose presence was nonetheless the most complete statement of consequence that Prater had ever driven into. "Hang up," Hank said. Prater looked at him for a long moment. Then he lowered the phone. "You know what you've done," Prater said. His voice was controlled. The control of a man who had learned that losing his composure was a form of losing. "You have no idea what you've walked into." "I know exactly what I walked into," Hank said. "I walked into a gas station 3 weeks ago, and I saw a 7-year-old girl who'd been taught that kindness was a trap. That's what I walked into." Something moved in Prater's face. Not guilt. Guilt required a different architecture of conscience than Prater had ever built. More like the recalibration of a man who had expected a different kind of opponent. "The drive is gone," Hank said. "It's been gone for 40 minutes. Whoever you just called. They're already too late." He kept his voice level. Conversational, almost. The tone of a man stating facts in a context where facts were the only currency left. "Warren Toll is on the phone with the state AG right now. Patricia Osei is going to recover. And Carmen Delgado has been building a paper record of this situation for 3 weeks that is going to be very difficult for anyone to make disappear." Prater was quiet. "Here's what happens now," Hank said. "You stay in this truck. Prescott PD is going to arrive in about 4 minutes. They got a call about suspicious activity on this street, and when they get here, they're going to find one man sitting in a vehicle and 150 riders doing nothing illegal on a public road. You're going to tell the officers whatever you're going to tell them, and then it's going to be out of my hands." "You think this ends here," Prater said. "For you?" "Yes. The people I work with are going to have more problems than you in about 6 hours," Hank said. "But that's above my pay grade. What's in my pay grade is making sure you do not go into that house and you do not make any decisions in the next 4 minutes that make things worse for yourself." Prater looked at him, at the street behind him, at the riders in their rows, still and patient in the August morning, at the specific mathematics of a situation that had no remaining angle. He put the truck in park. He put both hands on the steering wheel. 4 minutes later, a Prescott PD cruiser turned onto Copper Basin Road and slowed to a stop, and the officer inside took a long moment to absorb the landscape before he got out, which Hank understood entirely. It was a lot of landscape to absorb. The officer was young, 26, maybe 27, the look of someone who had not yet accumulated enough experience to have a protocol for this specific scenario. He walked to Hank with his hand not on his weapon but near it, which was the right call, which was what the training said. "Sir," the officer said, "can I ask what's going on here?" "Community support," Hank said. "We had information that a resident on this street needed some visibility. We're providing it." The officer looked at the riders, at Prater's truck, at Hank's cut. "The complaint that came in," the officer said carefully, "was about suspicious surveillance of a residence." "I know," Hank said. "The man who filed that complaint is sitting in the green Ram. You might want to run his name before you decide who the suspicious party is." A pause. The officer looked at the truck. Something in his posture shifted. The slight recalibration of a man receiving a prompt he was going to have to act on. "I'm going to need everyone to hold their current positions," the officer said. "Not a problem," Hank said. "We're not going anywhere." It took 3 hours. 3 hours of the August sun climbing, and the engines idling in rotation so they didn't overheat, and the diner 2 blocks over sending a woman out with a rolling cart of coffee and water that the riders accepted with the quiet gratitude of people who had been awake since before dawn and were too tired to pretend otherwise. 3 hours of radio calls and a second cruiser arriving, and then a third, and at the 90-minute mark a vehicle that was not a police vehicle but moved with police adjacency. Dark SUV, 2 men in civilian clothes who talked to the Prescott officers for 20 minutes before one of them made a call on a phone that was not his department phone. Warren Toll arrived at the 2-hour mark. He walked past the cruisers with the specific bearing of a man who had spent 11 years showing credentials to law enforcement and still knew exactly how to move through that architecture. He spoke to the men from the dark SUV for 11 minutes. At the end of those 11 minutes, Glenn Prater was escorted from his truck. He didn't look at Hank as they walked him past. Hank watched him go and felt none of the things he'd expected to feel. No satisfaction, no relief. Those came later, and even then they came incomplete, because the removal of a danger was not the same as the undoing of the damage the danger had done. And he understood that in his bones, in a way that made the moment quiet rather than triumphant. Rudy appeared at his shoulder. "A G's office confirmed receipt of the drive," Rudy said. "Toll's contact is moving." "Sandra." "Still in the house. Carmen's with her now." Hank nodded. He looked at the house, beige stucco, brown trim, and thought about what it had contained and what it would need to stop containing, and the distance between those two things. "Tommy," he said. "Has her," Rudy said. "She's good. She's—" He stopped. His jaw moved. Rudy was not a man who showed things in his face unless the thing was large enough to require it. "She asked Tommy if she was in trouble." Hank looked at him. "She thought she was in trouble," Rudy said, "because someone came and got her from school." He said it quietly, not as accusation, just as the specific unbearable fact of what a child could be taught to believe. Tommy told her no. He said, some people just wanted to make sure you were safe. She didn't say anything for about a mile. And then she asked if she could see her mom. "Where are they?" "Diner on Montezuma. Tommy's got her in a booth with a hot chocolate." Hank looked at the street, at the riders who were beginning to ease into departure now that the cruisers had settled into paperwork mode, the gradual dissolution of the column, bikes starting up and rolling out in ones and twos, the population of the street returning towards something that resembled ordinary. He walked to his bike. Bum-dum. The diner on Montezuma Street smelled like bacon grease and coffee and the specific warmth of a place that had been full of people since 5 a.m. It was past noon now, and the breakfast rush was gone, and the lunch crowd was thin, and Tommy Reeves was sitting in a corner booth with his big hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking like a man who had been trying very hard to seem unthreatening for the past 2 hours. Across from him, Lily was eating a grilled cheese sandwich. She was still in her school clothes. Her hair had come loose from the morning's ponytail. She had the careful, methodical focus of a child eating something good, not wolfing it, not the frantic pace of someone worried the food might disappear, but slow and attentive, the way children ate when the meal was safe. She looked up when Hank came in. He stopped at the end of the booth, crouched down so he wasn't towering, looked at her. She looked back at him with the gray eyes that had done their threat assessment in a gas station 3 weeks ago and had apparently filed the results somewhere, because what he saw in them now was not the rapid calculation of danger. It was recognition. "You're the water bottle man," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I am." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at her sandwich. Then she looked back at him with the directness of a child who had learned that indirectness was dangerous and had therefore developed a bluntness that most adults never achieved. "Is my mom okay?" "Your mom is okay," he said. "She's going to come see you very soon." "Is she in trouble?" "No." "Is the man going to be there, Glenn?" "No," Hank said. "Glenn is not going to be there." Something in her face changed. Not a smile, not yet, not that simply, but a small muscular release, the kind of thing that happened in a body when it had been braced against something for a long time and was tentatively, cautiously considering the possibility of not bracing anymore. She took a bite of her sandwich. Tommy looked at Hank over her head with an expression that contained several things and required no words. Hank stood up and went to the counter and got a coffee and sat 2 stools down and drank it and let the diner exist around him. The hiss of the grill, the bell over the door, the low television above the counter showing a weather segment, the ordinary, ongoing machinery of an ordinary place. Carmen came in at 12:40. She sat beside Hank at the counter, and the counterman put a coffee in front of her without being asked, which meant she'd been here before. Which meant this diner had somehow become a neutral territory for everything that had happened in the last 3 weeks. "Patricia Osei is being discharged today," Carmen said. "She wants to take the case personally, officially. She called me from the hospital." "That'll take time," Hank said. "Yes, but it's moving now. The AG's office has the drive. Toll's contact has been in a meeting for the past 4 hours that isn't going to end quickly." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "The network exposure is significant. The sealed conviction, the protection arrangement, the case interference. It's going to unravel a specific number of people who were very confident they were insulated." "And Sandra?" Carmen was quiet for a moment. "Sandra is going to have a complicated road. The history is real. Her involvement before 2021 is real. But the context is also real, and Toll's former colleague understands the distinction." She paused. "She is not going to lose Lily. That's the thing she needed to know most, and I told her 2 hours ago." Hank looked at his coffee. "She asked about you," Carmen said. "Sandra. She said to tell you that Ruth Escobar was right." He thought about Ruth, 67 years old, with roses and a widow's attention to her street, who had called Sandra and said, "Trust this man," who had become a link in a chain he hadn't known he was building. He made a note to go see Ruth. Not today. Today was too full. But soon. Behind him, he heard Lily say something to Tommy in a quiet voice, and Tommy's low response, and then, very quietly, a sound that it took him a moment to identify because it was so unexpected. A small, specific laugh, the kind that came from a child who had been reminded that laughter was available. He did not turn around. He sat and drank his coffee and let the sound exist behind him, and felt something in his chest that was old and heavy and had been stored there a long time begin, very slowly, to shift. Sandra arrived at 2:15. Carmen had driven her. She came in the door and stopped and looked across the diner to the corner booth, and Lily looked up from what she was drawing. The counterman had given her a pen and a paper placemat, the kind of practical generosity of people in diners. And for a moment neither of them moved. Then Lily got out of the booth and crossed the diner floor, and Sandra went to her knees on the linoleum, and they met in the middle, and Sandra held her daughter with the specific grip of someone who has been afraid of losing a thing for so long that holding it feels both like relief and like grief, the two things that live in the same place. Hank watched from the counter. He thought about what Sandra had said. "I told her today was going to be a good day." I don't know if that was the right thing to say. It was, he thought. It was exactly the right thing. Not because you could guarantee a good day. Nobody had ever been able to guarantee a good day, not for themselves or anyone else. But because the act of declaring it, of telling a child that goodness was incoming, was itself a form of protection. It was the opposite of "you are more trouble than you are worth." It was the sentence on the other side of that sentence, the one that took longer to say and longer to believe, but that built something instead of taking something away. Tommy Reeves was standing against the wall with his arms at his sides, looking at the floor, the way men looked at floors when they were feeling something they didn't have a container for. Hank stood up. He put a 20 on the counter. He caught Tommy's eye and nodded toward the door. They went outside together into the August afternoon. The council dinner was that night in Wickenburg. Not a formal meeting, a meal at the long table in the back of the clubhouse that they used for exactly this kind of thing. The table that had been there when the building was a machine shop and that had stayed because nobody could agree on whether to replace it, and eventually it had simply become part of what the place was. 18 people around the table, the core council, the chapter officers who'd ridden in, Tommy, Dell, Rudy at Hank's left hand as he'd always been. Aaron Drift sat across from Hank. They didn't talk about it directly at dinner. There was food. There was the particular loosening of people who had been through something together and were on the other side of it. There was Vic Salazar telling a story about the ride-in from Yuma that was funny in the specific way of stories about things that hadn't been funny while they were happening. After dinner, when most people had moved to the bar or the back room, Aaron stayed at the table with a beer. Hank stayed too. They sat for a while in the comfortable quiet of men who had said the important things and didn't need to repeat them. "The Flagstaff chapter is with you," Aaron said eventually. "Whatever you need, going forward." "I know," Hank said. I should have said that earlier." "You said it when you could." Aaron turned his beer slowly on the table. "I had a son," he said. It came out quiet, not a non sequitur. Hank understood immediately that this was the answer to the question he'd been carrying for 8 months. The reason Aaron Drift had been watching him with the specific wariness of a man who understood something about fathers. "He was 11. There was a situation I didn't handle the right way, and he got hurt. Not," he stopped, "not the way Lily was hurt, but the principle." He picked up the beer. "He's okay now. He's 22. He's in Colorado. He calls twice a month. But there are years I cannot give him back." Hank listened. "That's why I pushed back on this," Aaron said, "because I recognized the thing you were doing, trying to fix through a stranger what you couldn't fix at home. And in my experience, that doesn't—" He stopped again. "But I was wrong about what it looked like from the outside. I thought it was projection. I think now it was something else." "What?" Hank said. "Paying attention," Aaron said. "Differently than before. Because you understood what it cost not to." Hank looked at the table. The old wood, the rings from 20 years of coffee mugs and beer bottles, the specific geography of a surface that had held a lot of weight. "I called Maya this morning," he said. "Yeah." "She picked up." Aaron looked at him, said nothing. The nothing was enough. "But he went to see Ruth Escobar on Thursday. She was in her front yard when he pulled up. Not the roses this time. She was working on something at the fence line, a repair to one of the posts that she was making too complicated for herself because she was using the wrong tool." He watched her for a moment from the street. She looked up, saw him, looked at the post. "I've been meaning to fix this for 2 months," she said. "You've got the wrong wrench," he said. "I know." She handed it to him. He fixed the post. It took 10 minutes. She went inside and came back with 2 glasses of iced tea, and they sat on her porch in the afternoon shade and looked at the house across the street, which was quiet and had a for rent sign in the window that the property management company had put up that morning. "I heard they're placing her with a good family," Ruth said. "Temporary, but with the option to—" She stopped. "Is that true?" "That's what Carmen told me," Hank said. "It's being processed correctly. Patricia Osei is handling it herself." Ruth nodded. She held her tea glass with both hands, looking at the street. "She used to come over here," she said. "Lily. When Sandra would let her, I'd give her cookies and she'd sit right there." She indicated the top porch step. "And she'd draw. She draws butterflies. Always butterflies. I don't know where she got it from." Hank thought about the purple butterfly drawings in the case notes he'd seen, the documentation from the school, The one thing in the whole file that had been about Lily as a person rather than Lily as a subject of concern. A child who drew butterflies. A child who had a world inside her that the external world hadn't been able to reach. "You saved her," Ruth said. She said it directly, without sentiment, the way she said most things. "A lot of people did," Hank said. "You started it." He didn't argue. He drank his tea and looked at the empty house and thought about starts, about the specific moment of a start. A man crouching on a gas station floor to retrieve a water bottle, an act so small it barely registered. A moment that was also the first thread of something that would eventually pull an entire structure down and build something else in its place. He thought about the fact that you almost never knew which moment was the start. You only knew in retrospect, looking back, seeing the thread that connected everything. "Her mother," Ruth said, "Sandra. I know it's complicated." "It's complicated," Hank said, "but she loves her." "Yes," Hank said, "she does." Ruth nodded. That seemed to be the piece she'd needed to know most. She sat with it for a moment, and then she picked up her tea and changed the subject, and they talked about the fence post and the heat and the particular unreliability of the city's water pressure on her block. And it was ordinary and it was fine. And when he left an hour later, she stood at the porch railing and watched him go with the expression of a woman who had done what she could and knew it had been enough. 3 months later. The custody hearing was on a Thursday in October, which meant the desert had finally stopped trying to kill everyone, and the mornings were bearable, and the light had gone from white and punishing to something softer, the specific gold of an Arizona fall that lasted about 6 weeks before winter arrived. Hank rode up from Wickenburg the night before and stayed at the same motel on Gurley Street where he'd spent the first week of this, the room with the rattling AC unit that was now, in October, not running. And the silence in its place was different from the August silence, fuller somehow. More room in it. He didn't sleep well. He didn't expect to. At 7 a.m., he walked to the diner on Gurley and sat at the corner booth with his back to the wall and ordered coffee and eggs. He didn't fully eat and looked out the window at the street and thought about the things that had changed in 3 months and the things that hadn't. The network exposure had moved through the AG's office into federal territory by late August. 3 additional individuals had been indicted. The protection arrangement that had kept Glenn Prater functional for 3 years had been dismantled when the man at its center, a mid-level contractor who'd worked adjacent to 2 federal agencies, had been identified through the financial record on Toll's thumb drive and had quickly made the calculation that cooperation served him better than silence. Prater was in pretrial detention. His attorney was competent, and the process would be long, but the thing was moving and the outcome was not uncertain. Patricia Osei had returned to work 6 weeks after the accident. She had taken Lily's case file off her desk and put it at the top of her active pile and had not moved it since. Carmen called her twice a week. They had become, against all professional probability, something approaching friends. The specific friendship of 2 women who had both been working in the gap between what the system was designed to do and what it actually did, and who had finally found each other. Sandra Voss was in a supervised arrangement, not custody, not freedom, something complicated and honest in between. Her cooperation with the federal investigation had provided the context that Patricia Osei and Carmen had worked to establish. A woman who had been controlled and had resisted and had finally, when someone provided the conditions for resistance, chosen her daughter. It would take time. There were requirements and check-ins and a social worker who came to the apartment she'd moved to and who was, by all accounts, decent. She was rebuilding something. It was slow and uncertain and real. Lily was in foster placement with a couple in Prescott Valley, the Hartleys, mid-40s, who had 3 other children, and a house that was organized chaos in the specific way of houses where people were actually living in them. She was going to the same school. She was seeing a counselor twice a week. She was, Carmen said, drawing butterflies. The hearing today was about permanent protective placement and the beginning of the formal reunification process. Not adoption. Not yet. Not until the longer path had been walked. But the legal establishment of the structure that would surround Lily going forward, that would name the people responsible for her well-being and give that responsibility legal teeth. Hank drank his coffee. He looked out the window. At 8:15, the first bikes arrived. Not hundreds. That was not what today required. Rudy had talked to him about it, and they'd agreed. Today was not a statement. Today was a presence. A smaller thing, done with intention. 30 bikes. The people who had been closest to this, Dell, Tommy, Aaron Drift, who had driven down from Flagstaff the night before, the Prescott chapter members who had sat in this neighborhood for 3 weeks and known what they were sitting in. They parked in the lot adjacent to the courthouse. Not a formation, not a column, just people arriving. Some of them got coffee from a cart near the courthouse steps. Dell leaned against his bike and talked to Aaron about something that required hand gestures. Tommy sat on the curb with his phone. Rudy came and stood beside Hank on the sidewalk. Carmen's inside, Rudy said. Warren Toll is inside. Patricia Osei is inside. Sandra? Inside. A pause. She looks better. She looks like someone who's been sleeping. Hank nodded. Lily? With the Hartleys. They'll bring her at 9. He stood on the sidewalk in the October morning and felt the specific quality of this day. Not triumphant, not resolved, but weighted with the honest complexity of something that had been done right, and had therefore produced an outcome that was real rather than satisfying, which was the difference between actual justice and the story of justice. At 8:50, a minivan pulled into the lot. The Hartleys. A woman Hank didn't know. 40s, practical jacket, the organized energy of someone managing multiple children, got out and opened the side door and reached in and helped someone down from the van. Lily. She was wearing a purple jacket. Her hair was in 2 braids, neat and intentional, the kind of braids that took time and care. She had a backpack on that was the right size for her now. She stood in the parking lot and looked around and found, across the lot, the row of bikes and the people standing near them. She looked at them for a moment. Then she started walking, not toward the courthouse, toward the bikes. The Hartley woman started to say something, then stopped and watched her go. Lily walked across the parking lot with the purposeful directness that Hank had first seen in a gas station. The same girl, but moving differently, not close to the fences, not testing the space for danger, just crossing it. She stopped in front of Tommy Reeves, who was still sitting on the curb, and looked at him with the gray eyes. "You're the one who got me from school," she said. "Yeah," Tommy said. "You told me I wasn't in trouble." "You weren't." She considered him. Then she looked past him at the line of bikes and the people in the October morning, and her face did the thing that Hank had first seen in the diner. Not a smile, not yet, but the muscular release of a body that was reconsidering whether bracing was still necessary. Then she turned and found Hank. He hadn't moved. He was standing 20 feet away, and he was watching her, and she walked across the distance between them and stopped in front of him and looked up at him with an expression that contained more things than he could name. "You're the water bottle man," she said again. The same words she'd said in the diner. Her version of hello, her version of continuity, her way of saying, "I know who you are, and I have been thinking about it." "I am," he said. She reached into the front pocket of her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out to him. He took it, unfolded it. It was a drawing, a butterfly, purple and detailed, the wings asymmetrical in the specific way of hand-drawn things, the antennae slightly uneven, alive in the way that careful things were alive. He looked at it for a long time. "I made it for you," she said, "because you're the one who started things." He folded it carefully, put it in the inside pocket of his cut, against his chest. "Thank you," he said. She looked at the pocket where the drawing was. She seemed satisfied. Then she turned and went back to the Hartley woman and took her hand, and they walked together toward the courthouse doors. Rudy appeared at Hank's shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They stood together in the October light and watched Lily go inside. And around them the riders stood with their coffees and their quiet, and the specific patience of people who had learned that some things required you to simply be present while they happened. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Hank sat in the gallery with Carmen on one side and Warren Toll on the other. Sandra Voss was at the respondents' table with her attorney, and she kept her hands folded and her back straight and her eyes on the judge with the careful attentiveness of someone who understood that every choice she made in this room was being weighed. Patricia Osei testified. She was clear and specific and thorough, the kind of testimony that came from a professional who had stopped doing the minimum and was doing the real thing instead. She spoke about the case history, the original report, the reinvestigation, the conditions she had documented during her official visits over the past 6 weeks. She spoke about Lily in terms that were clinical and true, and which, underneath their clinical surface, contained the unmistakable shape of someone who gave a damn. Carmen testified about her role. She was brief and precise. Toll did not testify. His contribution was in the federal case, running parallel, and the judge had been briefed on the context without requiring him in her courtroom. Sandra testified last. She answered the questions about the past factually and without the softening that would have been easier. She spoke about the network, about the control, about the years in which her choices had been constrained by circumstances she had built and then been unable to leave. She spoke about February, when Prater had arrived, and what those 8 months had been. She did not ask for absolution. She asked for the chance to become the parent that Lily needed. The judge was a woman in her 60s who had the face of someone who had heard many things and had long since stopped being surprised and had not stopped, despite that, caring. She asked Sandra 3 questions when she finished. They were precise and direct. Then the judge looked at her notes for a long moment, and then she looked up and began to speak. Hank listened to the legal language, the terms, the structure, the framework of what was being established. And underneath the language, he heard the shape of it, what it meant in practical terms for a child who had been taught that she was not worth being nice to. Safety, continuity, the beginning of a formal path back toward her mother. When that mother had demonstrated the conditions were right, the legal names of the people responsible for the space around her, the teeth behind those names. He heard Sandra exhale at the table. Once, controlled, the exhale of someone who had been holding a breath for 8 months. Outside, through the courthouse windows, October light. Afterward, in the parking lot, the 30 bikes started up in 1s and 2s, and the sound of it filled the October air in the specific way that Hank had stopped needing to explain or justify. It was just the sound of these people, the sound of what they were, warm and mechanical and real. He stood by his road king and watched them go. Del went first, raising 2 fingers as he passed. Tommy next, and he was looking straight ahead with the set jaw of someone carrying something new. The specific gravity of a person who had been part of something important and was still figuring out what it had done to him. Aaron Drift last from the core council, and he pulled up alongside Hank and idled for a moment. They looked at each other. Aaron nodded once. Hank nodded back. Aaron rode out. Carmen was the last one standing with him in the lot. She was in her car, window down, and she looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been through the whole of this and was doing her own accounting. "You going home?" she said. "In a bit." She nodded. She started her car. Then she stopped. "Hank." "Yeah." "Call your daughter," she said, and she drove away. He stood alone in the lot for a while. The courthouse behind him, the October desert spreading out on every side, the sound of the last few bikes fading on the roads out of Prescott. He got out his phone, looked at Maya's contact, thought about a 20-year-old woman in an apartment near NAU, books and running shoes and a coffee mug, who had said okay with the careful minimum of available trust, and who had called him back the following Sunday, which was a thing he was still figuring out what to do with. He called her. It rang twice. "Dad," she said. "Hey," he said. A pause. Not uncomfortable. Just the pause of 2 people who were still learning how to occupy the same space over a phone line after years of not. "How did it go?" she said. "Today." "Good," he said. "It went good." Another pause. He heard her breathing, heard the background sound of her apartment. Music, low, the kind of music she'd always listened to that he'd never learned the names of. "I'm glad," she said. And she meant it. He could hear that she meant it. He stood in the parking lot and talked to his daughter for 22 minutes, which was longer than any conversation they'd had in 3 years, and most of what they said was ordinary. Her classes, his ride down, the weather in Flagstaff, the specific unreliability of the coffee at the campus library. And the ordinariness of it was the whole point, was the thing he'd been trying to find his way back to for years without knowing. That's what he was looking for. When they hung up, she said, "Drive safe." He said he would. He put on his helmet. He started the Road King. He sat for a moment with his hand on the throttle and felt the engine's vibration running up through his palms and into his arms and into his chest, that old familiar aliveness that had been one of the only things he'd reliably known how to feel for a long time. He thought about a purple butterfly folded in his inside pocket. He thought about a child crossing a parking lot without keeping close to the fences. He rode out of Prescott on Route 89 going south, and the desert opened up around him the way it always did, flat and vast and indifferent, and somehow in the way of large, indifferent things, honest. And the morning was October gold, and the air was cool enough to feel, and he rode through it without a destination and without urgency, which was the best kind of riding, which was the kind that put the road back underneath you and reminded you that moving forward was not the same as running from, that a man could be in motion and also, finally, at rest. The Road King ran steady beneath him. The desert stretched wide, and somewhere in Prescott, a little girl with gray eyes was drawing butterflies.